In this video, let's talk about broken authentication. In any system with users, authentication is key. And if authentication is incorrectly implemented, it can lead to various problems, and REST APIs are no different. If a REST API is built with an incorrectly implemented authentication system, it can lead to problems like complete compromise of API or compromising system's ability to identify the user. For example, authentication bypass. So let's see an example of incorrectly implemented authentication in our target API. Once again, let's take the login request and send it to repeater. I am making sure that the intercept is set to on, and I'm just invoking the request, and let me send it to repeater. Now we are going to discuss a flaw in this REST API which will allow us to bypass authentication. We have already discussed this particular flaw in view profile endpoint. It is SQL injection. This user login endpoint is also vulnerable to SQL injection. So let's assume that we do not have a valid set of credentials. So we will proceed with incorrect username and an incorrect password, which is test and test. Let's click on the send button, and as expected it says invalid user or invalid password. So now what we are going to do is we will check if this username parameter is vulnerable to SQL injection. So let's do that by putting a single quote. So let's try with a similar payload that we have tried earlier when testing view profile endpoint for SQL injection. So in this case it becomes single quote plus or plus single quote 1 single quote equals to single quote 1 and one more single quote hyphen hyphen plus. So this password equals to test parameter will be ignored by the SQL query. So let's hit send, and there you go. If you notice, we have obtained the email ID and the token, which are usually seen with a valid authentication request. So in this case, the authentication request is considered valid and we are getting a token for the user attacker. So this shows that the authentication mechanism is incorrectly implemented and the API is allowing a non-existing user to log in as the user attacker. And this is a classic example of authentication bypass. Now let's also check the vulnerable code associated with this login request. I am switching to my Ubuntu virtual machine. And let's log into the secure store server by using SSH. There you go. Now to check the vulnerable code, let's navigate to where www html v1, and then let's use vim to open users.php file. Now let me look for login. As you can see, this is the code where we are going to look for login. First, we are ensuring that the username and password are not empty. So they should have some value, and then they are directly being passed to this inline SQL query, which is the same problem that we have seen with view profile endpoint. Now in this case, the username and password are received from the user, and then they are directly passed to this particular SQL query without any additional validation. And this is what is causing this SQL injection vulnerability in this case. To prevent this, this particular SQL query has to be changed to a prepared statement. That is the fix that is recommended, but there are other ways to fix it as well. For instance, we can receive this input and place it in this variable, and before placing it in this SQL query, we can write additional code to make sure that this particular value doesn't have any malicious characters.